Imagine waking up one morning, stepping out onto your land like you always do, and seeing something strange happening in the distance. Big machines. Loud noises. People you've never seen before walking around with clipboards, pointing at the ground and talking about pipe layouts. At first, you think maybe it's roadwork or some utility job that's happening nearby. But as you walk closer, something clicks. They're not just near your property. They're on it. That was my exact experience. I live on a quiet ranch that's been in my family for years. It's not a massive operation, but it's peaceful. It's mine. I raise a few cattle, grow some crops, and mostly keep to myself. The land means a lot to me, not just for what it produces, but because it's part of who I am. So when I saw construction crews digging into the earth just beyond the tree line on the edge of my property, my stomach sank. I walked up to them, trying to stay calm, and asked what they were doing. One of them shrugged and said they were laying a water pipeline for the local HOA, the homeowners association from the nearby development about 2 miles down the road. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe they were just passing through and didn't realize this land wasn't public. But as I looked around, I noticed they'd already started digging. Deep trenches. Piles of dirt. Plastic pipes stacked in bundles. They were way past the planning stage. They were in full-blown execution mode. And worst of all, no one had even talked to me. I tried to stay calm. I told them they were on private property. They just smiled awkwardly and said they had permission. I asked from who. They didn't answer. That's when I knew something was really off. The next day I made a few phone calls. Tried to reach out to the HOA office. Left messages. Sent emails. No one got back to me. I even drove down to the neighborhood to speak with someone in person. When I finally tracked someone down, they told me, very casually, that the pipeline was being routed through my land because it was the most efficient path to get water to their homes. They said it was already approved. That it was no big deal. No big deal? They were running a major water line through my ranch without permission, without warning, and somehow thought that was just going to be okay. I asked them to stop. They told me they couldn't. The project was already underway and rerouting would be expensive. I told them I never signed anything. Never agreed to anything. They said they'd look into it. That's the kind of polite brush-off that really tells you one thing. They don't take you seriously. What made it worse was that they had already started burying the pipe. Every day more of it disappeared underground. The longer I waited, the harder it would be to get them to undo it. I was losing control of my own land foot by foot. So, I did what anyone would do. I got a lawyer. We went through all the documents. There was no easement. No agreement. Nothing on file that gave them the right to touch my land. Legally, they had no ground to stand on. But here's the problem. Undoing something like this isn't as simple as waving legal papers in someone's face. Once the pipe is in the ground, it's harder to reverse. More expensive. More complicated. They were counting on that. And that's when I realized something important. If I wanted to solve this, I had to stop thinking like a victim. So I started asking questions. Where was the water coming from? Who owned the source? Was it on city land? A private well? Something else? After some digging, no pun intended, I found out something interesting. The water they were piping wasn't from the city. It came from a natural spring about 3 miles upstream. It was a quiet little spot I'd been to before while hiking. I never paid much attention to it, but now it mattered a lot. Even more interesting? That spring was on land that had recently gone up for sale. A small, unused parcel that had once belonged to an old farming family. The sale hadn't gone through yet. No one had bought it. And that's when the idea started forming. They built a pipeline assuming no one would stop them. They thought the route was secure. They thought the source would always be there for them to tap into. But what if it wasn't? What if the spring, the lifeline of their entire plan, belonged to someone else? Someone who wasn't so quick to forgive. Someone like me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more I looked into what the HOA had done, the more reckless it seemed. They had built a pipeline based on pure assumption. No contracts. No agreements. No discussion. They just acted like the land was theirs to use, like my property was some empty field they could carve through without asking. It didn't make sense. How could a group of people be that careless? So I kept digging. I spent days going over documents, maps, county records, anything I could find. I wasn't just trying to get even anymore. I wanted to understand how they even thought this was legal. That's when I discovered something that honestly blew my mind. The HOA wasn't using city water. They weren't connected to the municipal system at all. Instead, they had been sourcing their water from a spring located a few miles away. The same one I had just found out was up for sale. That spring flowed into a narrow creek, and that creek ran through several properties before it reached their land. Somewhere along the way, they had installed a small pump station and pipeline to carry the water directly into their subdivision. That was their big plan: take water from nature, route it through a few backroads and unclaimed patches of land, and push it into their community like they owned it. No oversight. No real planning. Just make it happen. And it would have worked. It really would have, if they hadn't touched my land. See, they got greedy. Instead of working around private properties, they decided to run the pipe in the straightest line possible. And that straight line just so happened to cut directly across my ranch. A long, narrow strip through one of my back pastures. They probably thought I'd never notice. Or maybe they assumed I wouldn't care. But the second I realized they had no legal right to be there, everything changed. I called my lawyer again. We pulled every document related to the spring. Water rights, land ownership, even historical claims from decades ago. The spring had always been considered a private water source. It wasn't regulated like city water. It didn't belong to the state. It belonged to whoever owned the land it sat on. At that moment, I knew what I had to do. I called the real estate agent listed on the spring property. The land was still available. No offers yet. It was a small lot, nothing fancy. But it had something extremely valuable. A water source that fed into an entire neighborhood. We didn't waste time. Within days, I made an offer, above asking price, just to make sure no one else had a chance to step in. It was accepted almost immediately. Just like that, I became the legal owner of the spring. The very same one their whole system depended on. And here's where things got really interesting. The HOA still had no idea what was happening. They were still busy laying pipe across my land, thinking I couldn't stop them. But now, I wasn't just the guy who owned the land under their pipeline. I also owned the source at the top of the hill, the one that fed their entire water supply. I took a drive out to the spring the day after the paperwork went through. It was peaceful. You could hear the water bubbling gently from the rocks, trickling down into the small stream that ran through the woods. It didn't look like much. Just another quiet piece of land. But it held power, and I was now the one holding it. The old pump they had installed upstream wasn't even on their land. It was tucked behind a thicket of trees, almost hidden. I guess they thought no one would care or notice. They had been pulling water from that pump for weeks. Maybe longer. I stood there for a while, just listening, thinking about how far they had gone without asking a single question. They built a system with no backup plan. No alternative source. No way out. Just blind confidence that no one would challenge them. But I wasn't going to let it slide. That night I sat on my porch looking out over my fields. The stars were bright and the air was cool. It was the kind of quiet you only get out in the country. And somewhere beneath that quiet I could feel it building, that shift in power, that turning point. They had crossed a line and they didn't even know it yet. They were about to find out what happens when you build something on someone else's land without permission and assume they won't push back. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to argue. All I had to do was wait. It's strange how quickly the balance can shift when you hold the right piece of the puzzle. One week, I was just the guy watching strangers dig up my pasture. The next, I owned the very water they were stealing. And that's exactly what it was, stealing. They hadn't asked, hadn't negotiated, hadn't even sent a courtesy note. They just assumed I'd roll over. They didn't know me. Once the purchase of the spring went through, I had full rights to the water source. I wasn't bluffing and I wasn't playing games. I had it all in writing, signed, recorded, and official. The best part? Their little pump, the one buried just out of sight, quietly drawing water day and night, sat smack in the middle of the property I now owned. For the first few days I didn't do anything. I just watched. Quietly. I'd drive up to the spring, sit in my truck, and let the engine idle while I listened. The hum of their pump echoed faintly under the trees. That noise meant everything to them. It meant showers, sprinklers, drinking water, and swimming pools. Their entire system relied on it. They had no idea it was now mine. I could have shut it down right away. Cut the hose. Pull the plug. Make a scene. But that's not how I work. I wanted to be patient. Strategic. So instead, I had a new plan drawn up. One that didn't involve lawsuits or yelling. I installed a gate at the edge of the property. A sturdy, locked gate with clear signage. Private property, no trespassing. It didn't take long for someone to notice. A couple of the HOA board members showed up in a pickup truck a few days later. I was already there, leaning against the fence, sipping coffee when they arrived. They tried to act polite at first. Asked if I knew anything about the new gate. I told them I did. I told them it was my gate on my land. That's when the smiles dropped. They asked if I was aware their pump was back there. I told them I was more than aware. In fact, I was the new owner of the land it sat on. They didn't say anything right away. Just kind of stared like they didn't fully understand what I was saying. So I said it again, slower this time. You're pulling water from a spring that now belongs to me. And you're doing it without permission. They asked if we could talk it over. Work something out. I told them I was open to discussion. The same kind of discussion they never offered me when they cut through my pasture. You could see the panic starting to rise behind their eyes. These weren't bad people necessarily. Just entitled. Used to getting their way. They probably never thought someone like me would have the power to stop them. After that meeting, things escalated. They sent letters. Made phone calls. Some polite, some not so much. Their lawyer reached out, trying to convince me they had implied rights. I sent him a copy of the property deed and a copy of the state water rights that now listed my name. Legally, there was nothing they could do. So I finally did what they feared the most. I shut it off. Not in the middle of the day. Not with an audience. Just one quiet morning, I walked up to the pump house, flipped the switch and closed the valve. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was almost peaceful. And just like that, their water supply dried up. That afternoon, I got the first angry email from one of the board members. Then another. Then calls started rolling in. Homeowners were confused. Faucets weren't working. Irrigation stopped mid-cycle. Pool pumps went dry. They had built their entire neighborhood around a system they didn't control. I didn't reply right away. I let the silence speak for itself. The next day they showed up again, 3 of them this time. More serious, less friendly. They asked what I wanted. I told them I didn't want anything. I just wanted them off my land. I wanted them to respect boundaries, something they had failed to do from the beginning. They offered to pay monthly fees, shared maintenance, even a formal agreement. I said no. They had their chance. They chose to bulldoze their way through instead of having a conversation. That choice came with consequences. You could tell they weren't used to hearing no. But now they had no leverage. No pipeline route. No water. And no idea what to do next. They left without saying much. Just got in their trucks and drove off. And me? I sat back on my porch that evening just like before and listened. No trucks in the distance. No digging. No low hum of the pump. Just the wind moving through the grass. My land, my rules, and now my water too. The phone didn't stop ringing for days. Calls came in from every direction. The HOA board, their lawyer, even individual homeowners who somehow got my number. Some were polite, trying to reason with me. Others were furious, demanding that I turn the water back on right now. It was almost funny the way they spoke, like I had just flipped a switch out of spite and could be convinced to flip it back if they asked nicely enough. But this wasn't about spite. This was about ownership. About respect. And they had shown me none. The pipeline that ran through my land had gone silent. Water no longer flowed into the subdivision. It didn't take long for the real problems to start. First it was the lawns. The lush green grass they'd spent so much money on started to yellow and curl. Then it was the community pool, which sat empty and stagnant. Finally it was the homes themselves. Toilets stopped flushing, showers went dry, and kitchen taps spat air. They were in full panic mode. One board member even tried to accuse me of endangering public health. He claimed cutting off the water supply was a threat to the neighborhood. I sent him a copy of the original pipeline layout. I highlighted the section that cut through my land. I asked one simple question. Did you have permission to build this? No response. I could have taken legal action then and there, forced them to remove the pipe completely, sued for trespassing, even demanded damages for the land they'd torn up. But I didn't. I didn't want money. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to really feel what it meant to take without asking. A few days later, I saw something strange near the edge of the ranch. A couple of workers were back. They weren't digging though. They were measuring. Scoping out a new path. Turns out the HOA had finally accepted that I wasn't going to budge, and they were trying to figure out an alternative route for their pipeline. But here's the problem. Rerouting wasn't cheap and it definitely wasn't simple. To avoid private land they would have to go around. Way around. Through rocky terrain and dense woods. They'd need permits, environmental studies, time, and a lot more money than they had budgeted for. I watched them pacing through the trees, clipboards in hand, frustration written all over their faces. It was like watching someone realize they'd locked themselves out of their own house. But this was never their house. Not the spring. Not the land. Not the water. Some of the homeowners began showing up in person. One older couple knocked on my door and asked if they could just talk. They weren't angry. Just tired. Tired of the politics. Tired of the finger pointing. They admitted they didn't know the HOA had cut through private land. They thought everything had been handled properly. That part hit me a little. I believed them. I invited them to sit on the porch. We talked for a while. They told me how the HOA had promised low-cost water and minimal environmental impact. They had sold it as a smart, sustainable solution. No one ever mentioned that they were crossing property lines to make it happen. It wasn't the residents I had a problem with. It was the board, the people who thought they could bend the rules because they wore clean shirts and held meetings in fancy clubhouses. The ones who made decisions for hundreds of families but never once thought to knock on my door. A week after I shut down the pipeline, I got an official letter. The HOA was requesting an emergency meeting with me. They wanted to discuss options for resolution. I read the letter twice and laughed. It took a total collapse of their water system to get them to consider a conversation. But I showed up. They were already waiting in a rented meeting room in town. 6 board members, 1 lawyer, and a table full of paperwork. They started with small talk. I didn't bite. Then they got to the point. They wanted access to the spring. Temporary if needed. They offered to pay a rental fee. They talked about fair use, good faith, shared community goals. I let them talk. Then I asked them one question. If I had done what you did, built something on your land without permission, what would you have done? No one answered. That silence said everything. One of them finally admitted it. They messed up. They assumed no one would care. They thought the land was unoccupied. They thought I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't fight back if I did. That was the moment I knew they understood. But understanding doesn't erase what was done. And it doesn't give them back what they lost. I told them I wasn't interested in renting, selling, or sharing. Not anymore. They had their chance. They made their choice. And now they had to live with it. By now, word had spread far beyond just the subdivision. The local town paper picked up the story. Ranch owner shuts off HOA water supply after unauthorized pipeline project. I didn't ask for attention, but once it started, it was impossible to avoid. I started getting messages from people I didn't know. Some praising me, others asking for the full story, and a few just shocked that something like this had even happened. Apparently, this kind of thing wasn't as rare as I thought. HOAs overstepping, acting like they're above the rules, cutting corners because they think no one's watching. What made this different was that I pushed back, and I did it the right way. Quietly. Legally. With precision. A few ranchers from nearby counties reached out. They'd had similar run-ins with developers and city planners. One guy told me about a gas company that tried to run lines through his hay fields without notice. Another had a utility company chop down trees along his fence line without permission. They all said the same thing. People only stop when you make them stop. I'd never thought of myself as a symbol of resistance. I was just defending my land. But the more I listened to their stories, the more I realized this wasn't just about one pipeline or one spring. It was about something bigger. The idea that if you're small and quiet and mind your own business, people think they can walk all over you. And then they act surprised when you stand your ground. Meanwhile, back at the subdivision, things were getting tense. Their emergency water supply, a backup tank they rarely used, was nearly empty. I knew this because I got an anonymous tip. Someone from inside the neighborhood who'd been following the story. They said the HOA was holding meetings behind closed doors, scrambling for alternatives. They even considered trucking in water, but the cost was insane. They'd called multiple contractors to evaluate rerouting the pipeline, but the estimates were all over the place, 6 figures minimum, and that didn't even include permits. One contractor told them it could take 6 months just to get approval from the county for the new path. The board was in trouble. Homeowners were getting angry. The clean lawns were gone, replaced by dry patches of dirt. People were having to shower at gyms or stay with friends. Some were threatening to sue the HOA. They didn't care about the full story, they just wanted water. I don't blame them. But they were blaming the wrong person. I wasn't the one who made this mess. I just refused to clean it up for them. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I heard a knock on my front door. Not aggressive, not urgent, just a soft, steady knock. When I opened it, there stood a teenage boy and his mom. They weren't from around here, that much was clear. The boy held a bottle of lemonade. The mom just smiled and said, "We live in the neighborhood. Can we talk?" We sat on the porch. They didn't come to argue. The mom explained that her son had been learning about land rights in school. They had read about my situation and started talking about it at home. He had questions. About property, about laws, about fairness. It was strange at first, but we talked for almost an hour. I showed them the survey maps, the land deed, even the photos of the pipeline trench. At one point, the boy asked, "Did they ever say sorry?" I told him no. Not once. He looked down for a moment, then said, "They should have." That stuck with me more than anything the lawyers or board members ever said. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about respect. About knowing that your land isn't just empty space waiting to be used by someone with more money or power. It's part of your life. Part of your history. Later that week, I got another letter, not from the HOA this time, but from a group of residents. They'd come together independently to write a formal apology. Not a legal document. Just a letter signed by dozens of families saying they were sorry. That they didn't know the full story. That they wished things had been handled differently from the start. It wasn't everything. It didn't undo the damage. But it meant something. I kept that letter. And I noticed something else too. The pipeline workers never came back. No more trucks. No more surveyors. It was as if the whole thing had been put on pause. Maybe they were rethinking the entire plan. Maybe they'd finally realized that shortcuts come with consequences. Whatever the reason, the silence across the ranch was back. And this time, it wasn't the silence of people sneaking around or machines running in the distance. It was the sound of peace. Of boundaries being respected. Of knowing that when someone pushes too far, it's okay to push back. Even if you're just one person with a quiet patch of land and a whole lot of patience.